Recording started. And we've been having a lot of rain, Jimmy. How is it in Hong Kong?
Hot, 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 blue skies. And
Oh,
it's burning in the sun.
yeah, we are wet, really wet. Okay, we're going to do the Gospel of Matthew. I need to say
Why am I not able to connect to the...
It's okay, as long as you can hear us. Most Christians do not actually know each gospel properly, because what Christian churches, Adventist churches included, have done with the gospel story is to present what I call a collated view, where we have even created a timeline based on the different gospels and stretch the story out. And yet we do have 4 gospels, and they are quite distinctive. Now, I know that for Sabbath school lesson this quarter, they are looking at the Gospel of Mark, so that's a totally different equation altogether. We're going to look at Matthew, which is fairly long. 28 chapters, a great deal of material. So we will see. It probably take us maybe 6 or more weeks to do justice to the book. So hopefully you will stay with us through the series. We need some pre-thoughts to understand what we are going to examine. The first is to understand the word gospel, which comes from the Greek euangelion. Most of you know this, which has the meaning of good news. That's the one that you normally hear from the pulpit. But a more correct translation of euangelion is the idea of proclamation. Think of it like the old days, and this still happens in some villages in the world, where you have a guy walking through the village, making announcements, proclamations of meetings, or somebody died, somebody is born, or announcements. Here in Thailand, they do it on loudspeaker. My village has loudspeakers attached all over, and somebody from the office. They do that when they have elections. They mount sound systems on the pickup trucks. The pickup trucks will drive, and this thing will be playing, telling the agenda of the politician or whoever is seeking election. So that's closer to what the word gospel means than just simply good news. It's a lot more. Not everything we hear in the gospels or we read in the gospels is really good news in the normal sense of the word. And so we should keep that in mind as we go along. Now, when it comes to how the word is used, when you see in theological writings at least, gospel being spelled with a capital G, that is a reference to the book. But if it's not capitalized, that's a reference to the message. So there is a differentiation there. One is a proper name, the other one is common noun. In English, the name of the gospel is either Matthew, as in most modern translations, or in the older translations, gospel according to Matthew. In Greek, it is simply according to Matthew. And this is true for all 4 gospels. Kata Matthaion, meaning according to Matthew. But it's also important to note that the title of the book was added later, was not part of the original, what we call autograph or such. When dealing with the Gospels, we need to try and figure out what are they. As Christians, we take them for granted, but in the world of scholarship, there's a lot of debate about what are the Gospels really. The most commonly accepted view among critical scholars is that the Gospels are a religious mythology. They are not real, they're not factual. We don't really know if any of the characters here were real characters or not. They stand on the same level as the mythologies of Hinduism or the mythologies of the Greeks, and so on and so forth. Now, evangelical Christianity, by and large, rejects this view. This is not religious mythology. This is real story. A second scholarly proposal about the Gospels is that they are etiology. Now, an etiology is a story that is used to explain something which may be based on fact. Let me give you a kind of a humorous etiology. Have you ever wondered why brides carry a bouquet flower at their wedding? This is something that came from Europe. And one of the etiologies of the bridal bouquet is this. The weddings took place in spring or summer, because during the winter it's just too cold to really have weddings. But people in Europe do not bathe during the whole winter time. And so by the time spring comes, they're not smelling very good. That includes the bride. And so they would camouflage her body odor by carrying this huge bouquet of flowers so that the wedding will go nicely. That is an etiology. It is based on real life events, but it's not so much real in and of itself as more an attempt to explain how something started. The idea here is that the Gospels explain to us how Christianity started, not so much worrying about the history of it. And you can see as we get a little further why this view would work for some people who have a difficult time comprehending the differences between the four Gospels. Now, the third view is that it's historical biography. Seventh-day Adventists generally subscribe to this view. It is factual. The difficulty with this view is that you discover the history of Matthew and Luke are very different, and we will touch on that as we go along. Mark's history, if you follow the Gospel of Mark, the ministry of Jesus only lasted for a few weeks. I mean, literally a few weeks. It is only in the Gospel of John, because he lists 4 Passovers, that we discover the ministry of Jesus is 3+ years. Even Matthew and Luke do not have a clear image of how long the ministry of Jesus was. There's a lot more common ground as to his pre-ministry days, but how long his ministry days is dependent completely on John. If we only had the Gospel of Mark, Jesus had a hugely truncated ministry, which of course would not fit all the stories that we have in here. Now, biblical scholars contend that the stories or the books we know as Gospels are a unique genre of literature. They don't belong to any of these categories. They're not religious mythology, they're not etiologies, they're not even historical biography. They are a different set of scriptures. And I think the Christian church recognized this quite early by classifying these books in this genre. By the way, by the time Matthew wrote, there were 30 other so-called Gospels in circulation in early Christianity. And so any book that was written concerning the life of Jesus was considered a Gospel. And so we have numerous Gospels that were never accepted by the church as canonical, such as the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Judas Iscariot, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and a bunch of Gnostic Gospels, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind, that Gospel was a unique genre of literature that applied to books writing the story of Jesus. And these 4 were not the only ones. Ignatius was the first father who suggested, not Ignatius, I think Irenaeus, who first suggested that we should stick to just 4 Gospels, because there are too many in circulation. Think of it like having multiple biographies of some well-known person's life. The multiplicity of Gospels tell us that people really wanted to tell the story of Jesus. But we also see differences depending on where the Gospels were written. In Egypt, they tended to be a little more fanciful. In Antioch, they tended to be a little more literal and compact, and so on and so forth. So the church eventually, by the Council of Carthage, around 390 AD or so, settled on these four as representing the canonical versions of the life of Jesus. So Matthew is one of them. There is still a lot of debate among scholars whether Matthew was the first one written, or maybe Mark, or maybe another gospel from which Matthew, Mark, and Luke borrowed. It's often labeled by scholars as Gospel Q. It really doesn't matter. I think there's many scholars who believe Matthew is first, and there are others who believe that Mark is first. Luke clearly came a little bit later. We need to understand how we get our Gospels, basically textual transmission. Because of all this debate about what kind of literature it is, it's important to understand this process. Now, we know that the stories about Jesus were transmitted down from at least 2 generations in oral versions. And then people started writing them down, including Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then eventually John. And so the original copy that they wrote, which we would call a draft today, is known to scholars as autographs. Now, here's the thing about biblical autographs. We have not a single one, not even of these 4 Gospels. There is no Bible autograph in existence. What we do have are tons of manuscripts. The best manuscript of the New Testament, which contains the entire New Testament and is considered to be the most reliable manuscript, called the Sinaiticus, comes from the 4th century. So we're talking, Matthew was written in the 1st century, so we're talking about nearly 300 years later. And then the Greek critical text was first produced in 1516, a year before Martin Luther launched his Reformation, by a Dutch scholar called Erasmus. So what this guy did was to assemble all the manuscripts available up to that time, and the Bible Society is updating what he had done, and then collating from all that material what is the most possible, the most probable text. You and I, we are dealing entirely from translation. And the multiplicity of translations, especially in English, but this is true with every language now, tells us that it's quite difficult to get some things right. Now, the King James was very popular for about 400 years, but the English got outdated. The translation was actually pretty poor most of the time, with lots of misunderstandings of text, a lower level of understanding, particularly of Hebrew. They were a little bit better with the Greek, and too much dependence on Tyndale and the Vulgate and so on that had come before them. I was watching a BBC Songs of Praise program about the Isle of Farne, and I learned from that the monks who created that little island monastic community, they were the ones who translated the Gospels into English, the first translation before Tyndale and all, before Wycliffe and Tyndale. And so, using very old English, you and I would not be able to read or understand what they wrote, because we are influenced by the King James, with William Tyndale and the King James, which is considered Middle English. And then now with modern English changing so rapidly, we have multiple translations. And there are variances between especially complexity of Greek grammar, unlike Hebrew grammar, which is quite simple. Greek grammar was extremely complex. And so even though it seems easier to read because the letters, the alphabets are similar to English, the grammar is much, much more demanding. And that brings us to one of those accounts of the life of Jesus that we know as the Gospel of Matthew, or simply according to Matthew, or simply Matthew. Some basic information about the book. We know the author. His name was Matthew, clearly as suggested even in the Greek. We also now know the date. This is in agreement by critical as well as evangelical scholars, somewhere in the middle of the first century, probably just a few years before the destruction of Jerusalem. So usually dated to around 65, 66 AD. This would be roughly about the time that Paul and Peter would be executed. Both Paul and Peter would be executed around 67 AD in Rome. So the timing of Matthew, which is more or less the same time as Mark and Luke, is very, very critical to understanding, because that would mean that the first generation of leaders were almost gone. Matthew himself would die just shortly after this. Most of the disciples were dead by this stage. Paul and Peter were about to die. So that first generation of eyewitnesses were about to disappear from the scene, and the church was changing. We don't know exactly where it was written. Some people suggest in Caesarea, but most probably Ethiopia, because that's where Matthew would die of martyrdom. The latter part of his ministry would be there. So most likely in Ethiopia, but no one can settle the debate. The timeline is important. The gospel was written about 35 years after Jesus. Jesus lived, eventually went to heaven around 31 to 33, depending on your calendar dating. Most Adventists tend to accept the year 31 as the crucifixion year and 33 as the year as his starting the ministry, and 33 as his death. The audience, again, there is some debate about this. Because of the heavy use of the Hebrew Bible, what we call Old Testament, people suggested the audience was Jewish. Now, if he was in Ethiopia and he was writing from there, there were a lot of Jews who lived in northern Africa, who had run away from the land of Israel during the invasion of Nebuchadnezzar. Most people whom Nebuchadnezzar did not take to Babylon, they simply ran away to Egypt and probably migrated down into Ethiopia, maybe the Sudan. That's why there's such a large number of Jews that were relocated to the land of Israel, or to the country of Israel, in 1948 and after 1948 from both Egypt and Ethiopia. In fact, they're very distinctive, particularly the Ethiopic Jews. When you walk through Israel, you can see them. They are very different from the Sephardic and Ashkenaz Jews who came from Europe, or the Arabic Jews who came from Morocco and Tunisia and Libya and Egypt and Jordan, and so on and so forth. The more likely scenario, though, I think, is that he wrote to Jewish Christians. See, because he's living at the end of that first generation of Christians. And by that stage, there was a great moving away or separating of paths between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians, causing a virtual dichotomy. There had already been a major church council in 50 AD to try and resolve the differences between these two groups. And so this would be a more likely scenario of an audience. Matthew trying to convince the Jewish Christians that he is writing about Jesus, and that Jesus that he knows, that he writes about, that he actually saw and lived with for 3 years, that he is the Messiah. What do we know about the man himself? Not very much. We know his full name. He was Levi Matthew. We know his ethnicity. He was Galilean. At the time of Jesus, there was a lot of differentiation between the Jews who lived in Galilee and the Jews who lived in Judea. They actually spoke different dialects of Aramaic. They could tell each other out just by listening to one another. Oh, you're from Galilee. That's what Peter faced at the trials of Jesus that led him to deny knowing Jesus. You're a Galilean. Your accent, your pronunciation betrays it. And so the Galileans were seen as being kind of the rednecks, the hillbillies of Jewish society at the time. Rough, not very sophisticated, not highly educated, at least formally speaking, whereas Judeans, because they're closer to the temple, they're more religious, they are more educated, they have all those priests to instruct them, and all the rabbis, famous rabbis, lived there, and so on and so forth. So there was this feeling between Judeans and Galileans. Even the Romans noticed this. That's why when they placed Judea directly under Roman procuratorship, they never did that with Galilee. They left the Herod family to look after Galilee and so on. And yet, the first major revolt against the Romans came from Galilee. Most of the so-called zealots, the rebels against Roman rule, the Jewish rebels, today we would call them the Jewish equivalents of Hamas or ISIS or whatever. These guys were mostly from Galilee. And so there was a lot of wars up there in Galilee between the Romans and the Greeks and so on. So he came from a very volatile part of the land of Israel. But what is important about this is that apart from Judas Iscariot, all the other 11 were Galileans. Was Jesus racially, ethnically biased? Something to think about. But he chose Galileans. He chose people he knew, people that he could talk to. I almost imagine that Jesus spoke with a heavy Galilean accent, not the refined accent that you have in around Jerusalem in Judea. We also know about his job because Jesus walks up to his office one day and say, "Come, follow me." He was a tax collector. Now, this is important to understanding Matthew as a human being. Tax collectors were the most hated, the most vilified, the most ostracized Jews in society. In fact, they were hated so much and considered collaborators with the Romans that they were not allowed into the temple. They were not allowed into the synagogue. Can you imagine what it was like? We know a lot more about Zacchaeus because of the way his story is told in Luke, but Matthew would have suffered that same fate. He could never go to synagogue on Sabbath. When all townspeople would be in the synagogue, reading the scriptures and listening to the rabbis discourse on the scriptures, he had to stand outside. Maybe he went and listened through the window, eavesdropping or whatever. Spiritually, they were starved. And this explains why Jesus walks up to his office and says, "Follow me," and he immediately follows. But there's another reason for Jesus choosing Matthew. Tax collectors were rich. 6 of the disciples of Jesus were fishermen and they were rich. The other one was a tax collector and he was rich. Jesus had no money, so he called men to serve him who had plenty of it. When he called Paul, Paul had plenty of money too. This was a unique thing about Jesus' ministry that we have never paid close attention to. The preacher does not have to be rich. Rabbis, by and large, were not rich, but their students needed to be rich. They have to pay for the rabbi. And so Jesus had a treasurer. Why would Jesus and the disciples have a treasurer if they had no money? See, these guys brought money in. I almost get the picture based on Acts and what happened with Barnabas, that Matthew didn't just walk away, that he brought his wealth with him. And he would become a major source of funding for this fledgling ministry. So there were 2 important reasons for Jesus choosing Matthew. A man who was hated by everyone, who lived without friends other than fellow tax collectors, who could never come into direct contact with the God of Israel, but a man who probably had a deep spiritual longing and who was prepared to put his money where his mouth was, unlike a lot of Christians these days. What we meet about him in all 4 Gospels is he's one of those background disciples. There is no separate story about him other than the one about his calling. We have individual stories about Peter and James and John and Philip and Thomas and Nathaniel, but really none about him. He's one of the backbenchers, kind of like the other James, the other Judas, the other Simon, So there were a group of them. They probably formed a clique within the disciples who were always on the fringes. You see, Peter, James, and John, they were the highlight ones. They were the special three. And then you have the ones that Jesus interacted directly with, like Philip and Thomas and Nathaniel. And so we have this intriguing picture about the people around Jesus. These were the background people. We never read about these background disciples doing anything but sacrificing their lives for Christ. And so that's important. You can serve God and even give your life for him, but you don't have to be in the front line. You don't have to be a highlight reel or a high display disciple to do that. And they all would die, martyr's death. When reading the book, we know that he was meticulous with details. He was a tax collector. You couldn't get your maths wrong, otherwise the Romans would have you killed for getting it wrong. He was extremely familiar with the Hebrew Bible. He quotes the Hebrew Bible, direct quotation, allusions, echoes, more than any other gospel writer that we have on record. He was martyred in Ethiopia. According to church tradition, he was basically flayed or beaten to death with whips. That would have been a slow, excruciating, painful way of dying. Hopefully, they were not Roman whips, which Jesus was beaten with. We don't know what kind of whips they used in Ethiopia. What's amazing is that Ethiopia is the center of what we know as Coptic Christianity, the oldest version of Christianity, the only version existing today of Christianity that can actually be traced directly to a disciple of Jesus to the 1st century. All the other versions of Christianity we have today, they have much later history. Roman Catholic Christianity is 7th century AD. Protestant Christianity is 16th century AD. Orthodox Christianity is about the same time as the Roman Catholic Church. So the Coptic Church of Ethiopia probably can be traced back to Matthew's ministry. So he may have been killed there, but he would help to start the oldest, the longest existing Christian version in the world. Now, if you were to go to Jerusalem, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it's administered by 4 different denominations. And one of those denominations, one section, is by the Coptic Christians from Ethiopia. What's intriguing about the Coptic Ethiopians is that they claim to this day that they have in their possession, in some secret hideaway, the Ark of the Covenant, supposedly that Solomon gave to the queen from Ethiopia who went to visit him. Though Queen of Sheba is probably more likely Arabia, but it's been appropriated by the Ethiopians. So Ethiopia has been Christian territory, one of the oldest Christian territories from the time of the disciples themselves. Now, when we read the gospel, we know that Matthew was very, very much a true-blooded Jew. He constantly links his gospel with the Old Testament. There is a conscious reference to Genesis in the beginning of the book. He makes reference to Elijah, which is indirectly through the reference of the prophet Malachi. He links Jesus to David and Abraham. It's a very important part of how he does the genealogy of Christ. There are 62 references to the Old Testament in the book. 28 chapters, 62 references. That's more than 2 per chapter in the book. Some chapters a lot more. Then 44 of those references are direct quotations from the Old Testament. And so Matthew is really, really important. And I think the early church may have placed him as first in that grouping, not because he was written first, but because of this use of the Old Testament, he is the natural link to the Old Testament, is writing his gospel. Matthew's approach to the gospel story, to the story of Jesus, is what we would call today a topical rather than chronological approach. The one who was the most chronological is actually John. Next best is Luke. Mark has no chronology that we can trace. Matthew has some, but it's mostly topical. What do we mean by that? He records 5 discourses of Jesus, and we know these as the Sermon on the Mount, his instructions to the 12, the kingdom parables, kingdom lifestyle. We won't be studying all of these in details. The Mount of Olives discourse. Okay, so the first important sermon, the last important sermon, we will definitely be examining those. He portrays Jesus as the Messianic king. Most scholars, including those who are critical scholars, have accepted this part of Matthew. And you can see this by simply doing simple deduction. Royalty terms appear 68 times in the book. This is more than any other book in the New Testament and more than most books in the Old Testament as well, except those history ones. The word king is used 14 times. By the way, you may not always see this in the English Bible. You'd really have to go into the Greek to see this, because sometimes the English Bible does not translate redundancies. Okay. The word kingdom is used 17 times in the gospel. The most important phrase in Matthew is this: the kingdom of heaven, 32 times. So nearly half of these 68 royalty terms is actually the kingdom of heaven. And then occasionally, only 5 times, the kingdom of God. So as far as he's concerned, Jesus is the Messianic king, not just any Messianic king. By tracing him back directly to David, he is presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of a type. David is a type of the Messiah. The king, even the Old Testament prophets would tell us that he would be like David. And so this is the king from the tribe of Judah, king like the Lion King. Okay. Jesus as the son of David, again, another royalty term, because David is really seen as the founder, the true king of Israel, 8 times. When the Magi appeared before Herod, their question was very simple: where is the king of the Jews who has been born? Implicitly, they were discounting Herod as king of the Jews. Now, Herod was not a Jew, he was half Jew. While the Romans accepted his kingship or appointed him as king of the Jews, and he tried very hard to present himself as a Jew, the Jewish people never accepted Herod as their king. And so can you imagine all the red flags that shut up the moment the Magi said, where is the king of the Jews to be born? When Satan, in the third temptation, he offered kingship to Jesus. If you will bow down to me and worship me, I will grant you the world. And we will be talking about the temptations a little bit. And then the authoritative nature of Jesus' speech, which is a little different from the other Gospels. 50 times, again, more than twice every chapter, he uses this phrase, I say to you. You know, in the prophet books, if you recall the prophets that we've been through, Amos and Zechariah, they often employed the phrase, the Lord says, to display their authority. Jesus shows his authority not by saying the Lord says, or God says, or even my Father says. He says, I say to you. Remember how he treated the 10 Commandments? You have heard it said, you shall not kill, but I say to you, that trumps anything that is written. Eventually, they tried to kill Jesus because they realized he was claiming to be this messianic king. They knew the prophecies, but they were unwilling to accept them. The Romans couldn't accept another king because only the emperor, only Caesar could be king. And the fact that in the gospel, people often worship Jesus, and this is true with all the four gospels, tells us that he accepts this status that he has. What about his timeline? And this is important because Matthew's timeline and Luke's timeline are very different. In fact, they are so different that you cannot harmonize them, even though people try to do that with Christmas pageants. Okay, let me show you how this works. So based on what we now know about the kingship or the reign of Herod the Great, the Annunciation, the birth, the visit of the Magi, and the escape to Egypt would have taken place around 6 to 5 BC. Jesus would have been born around 6 BC. We know that he was in Egypt for about a year. The Magi visited Bethlehem a few months after his birth. Okay, so all those early events would take place around 6-5 BC. Now, the infants of the slaughter of the infants in Bethlehem and then the return to Nazareth would take place around 5-4 BC. There's a reason for this. Herod died in 4 BC, more or less, and the angel told Joseph that it's now safe for them to return. Here is where we run into a chronological problem, because in Luke, there is no Egypt stay. In Luke, after 7 days, Jesus was brought to the temple to be circumcised and dedicated, and then the family immediately returns to Nazareth. There's a gap of at least 1 year difference between Matthew's chronology and Luke's chronology. That's why we can't really tell the story as if it is on one line, because Luke's account and Matthew's account are on different timelines altogether. They probably only converge around AD 26-27, the baptism, temptations of Jesus, his first sermon, the Galilee ministry. The transfiguration would have taken place about a year later, around AD 29. I have been to Mount Tabor. It's quite an impressive mountain. I can imagine what would have happened to the disciples seeing Jesus in his glory on that mountaintop. And then the so-called Passion Week would be around AD 30-31. Okay, the triumphal entry. Some people would date it a little bit later. The Passion Week, his death, and eventually his ascension and return to heaven. So Matthew does not make chronological statements, but by tracking his stories, this is the rough timeline that we have. So what are we going to do in this study of Matthew? And this is important to you because this is a big book with a lot of detail, and we cannot go into everything here. It will take us a lot more than 6, 7, 8 weeks. So we're going to do this. We're going to examine first the nativity plus narratives. This is up to, the return to Nazareth. So we're going to look at that set of narratives. We're not going to follow chapter by chapter, by the way. We're going to go clumps of data. And then we will also examine, after that, the passion narratives, because that's a big block from 26 all the way to the end of the book. So we will look at those early narratives and then at the ending narratives. Okay, we're not going to follow chapter by chapter. Then we will examine the kingdom parables. And since there are quite a few of these, okay, we will have a look. These are very familiar, most of them, though there's 1 or 2 that Christians are not so familiar. And his parables are very different from Luke's parables. There are a few shared parables, but a lot of them are different. Matthew almost always introduces his parables as the kingdom of God is like. You don't find that so much with Luke. It's a little different style of telling parables, plus very different parables as well. And then we will look at the Sermon on the Mount. We cannot ignore his first sermon. We may need more than 1 session for this. the longest recorded sermon of Jesus, even though many scholars believe, and I also believe, this was not a sermon that he sat one time and preached in one sitting, but rather a series of shorter sermons in the Galilee area that were then compiled by Matthew into one sermon. And then this Sermon on the Mount is the early part of the sermon, and then towards the end of his life, before the Passion narratives, Jesus would preach another lengthy sermon known as the Mount of Olives Discourse. Both of these sermons are preached from mountaintops, more or less. Okay, and so I have been to both of the mountains, Mount of Olives and the Beatitude Hill, or whatever. And so we need to examine them that way so that we can see. When we do that, we can see perhaps the fullest picture of what Jesus taught as recorded by Matthew. And then we need to do this. Since Matthew is writing to the Jews, what we discover, or Jewish readership, maybe Christian as well, what we discover, there's a lot of head-butting between Jesus and the religious establishment. Jesus and the Pharisees, Jesus and the Sadducees and the priests and so on. So we need to examine what happens in these encounters, how Jesus dealt with the challenges that they threw at him, the questions that they threw at him, the stories they made up about him, the accusations they threw against him. Okay, so we will look at those as a separate clumps. They're found in different places in the gospel. But I think it will give us a bit of a view of how Matthew tried to present Jesus. Jesus was not a man of the establishment. He was anti-establishment. And probably why he got killed in the end. And that brings us to the end of this introduction of the Gospel of Matthew. If you have time during this next few weeks, sit down and read the Gospel, keeping in mind that Matthew did not actually write chronologically. So don't expect all the stories, all the sermons to be on a straight line of time. We have a rough timeline of when the story may have started, when it may have ended, but we have clumps of materials, a sermon here, a sermon there, a sermon somewhere else, a group of parables here, a group of parables there. And then, like spies all through the gospel, these encounters with the religious leaders, the establishment of his days. Those would have been difficult for Matthew himself because he was a Jew, and having to show to them that they did not get it. And that whenever God sends, this is a pattern all the way back to the prophetic period, the period of prophets in the Old Testament, all the way back to Moses. God's established leaders never get it when God sends a prophet. And my reading of this, just in advance, is that if a reformer were to arrive in Adventism today, like reformers came in the Catholic Church in the 16th century, the established church would never accept them. Acceptance by the established church does not make you a true servant of God. And so my worry with a lot of pastors who are so deep into protecting their rice bowl, into towing the line of the denomination, is that very often they will shut out the voice of God, which is asking them to take a position, to take a stand, to preach the full word. Okay. And so we have to keep our ears tuned to this. Some of it will be very dissonant because we'll be like, are we doing that? Some of you here represent the religious establishment, elders in your church or church leader or whatever. Maybe you sit in conference or mission committees or whatever. Throughout the Bible and the history of the Christian church, God has never really worked out his will through the religious establishment. Never. I cannot find a single instance where it worked that way, but rather through anti-establishment characters that he would send around. Old Testament calls them prophets, New Testament calls them apostles, And Christianity calls them protesters. Okay, that's where the word protest first came out. All these people protesting the war in Gaza have no idea that the first true protesters were Christians protesting against religious establishment. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm saying this to you so that you will be better prepared to accept some of the dissonance that we will encounter. It would have been difficult for Matthew because many of the first generation leaders of Christianity were also Jews, and they stood in the way of the gospel. They tried to derail the ministry of Peter. They tried to derail the ministry of Paul, especially. They hounded Paul from city to city, synagogue to synagogue. It was not the Jews who hounded him. It was the Jewish Christian leaders who didn't want him to preach a gospel of grace. They wanted him to preach a more Jewish gospel, a gospel of law. And so this has been the struggle of God's people throughout history. God did not raise a leader from within the Jews in Egypt. He brought one from the outside, Moses, who had been away from them for 40 years. And this would happen again and again. David was a bit of an outsider. And when Saul died, 10 of the tribes refused to accept David as their king, even though Samuel had proclaimed him as king, anointed him. And the refusal by the 10 tribes lasted for 7 whole years. And David was the chosen of God, but he had to stay on the sideline for 7 years before people would accept him as such. Solomon was chosen by God to succeed David, but some of David's own sons tried to overthrow or to get in the way to launch a coup so that Solomon could not get on the throne. The prophets were rejected. Ahab labeled Elijah as the true troubler of Israel. And the contest between Ahab and Elijah is one of the most intriguing and most humorous in the Bible, between established religion and anti-establishment. Jesus was considered to be a maverick. They accused him of being a glutton. They accused him of being a heretic. They accused him of breaking all kinds of laws. They accused him of being the devil. Okay, and so this is a pattern, not only in the Bible, but throughout Christian history. And maybe one of the reasons why contemporary Christian churches are so laid back, they're so at ease with a world that's about to blow up in a third world war, that they are complacent because there are no prophets or apostles. There are no anti-establishment leaders who speak out and write out against things that the church is doing. Just to give you a very Adventist example, when Ted Wilson campaigned to be re-elected for a third term in General Conference as General Conference president, do you know that he manipulated the Constitution of the church, which was designed after the Constitution of America, which limited a GC president to 2 terms. Ted Wilson basically got that rewritten so that he can have a third term. And I've met many of the vice presidents around Ted Wilson. Most of them are now actually foreigners, not like in the days of his father when they were all Americans. And all these foreigners, I talked to some of them and they were very upfront about it. Their real reason for wanting to be in the GC, while there's so much rush to be in the GC office, is that it was a direct path to an American green card and immigration for the entire family. Every single one of those vice presidents now holds an American green card or American citizenship for themselves and their family. They're not there for service. They are there. So if you have a vice president from Tanzania, he's not there because he has a great love for the church in Tanzania. Okay, the church is struggling a bit in Tanzania. No, he's there because he got green card. But nobody dares to speak about this. Some did, few years ago, there was a man that I respected a lot. His name was David Newman. He started speaking about it, and they got him out from the ministry magazine, pushed him into some unknown church, and nobody hears about David Newman these days. And so the process never changes. When religion becomes institutionalized, and Adventism is at the right age of institutionalization, that's what happens. Okay. So Matthew's gospel would not have sat well with a Jewish audience, even though it may have been intended for them. And we need to understand that as we go along. All right, before we pray, any thought, any question, anything not clear from the introduction?
So about the
Stop the recording first.